The sound of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Gold Hill, Colorado, as Abigail Harmon clutched her medical bag and ran toward the commotion. She'd been the town's only doctor for just 3 months, but already the rhythm of violence and injury had become distressingly familiar. It was 1876, and the mining town nestled in the Rocky Mountains had seen its share of trouble since the gold rush began. Doc Harmon. A man waved frantically from the doorway of the saloon. "There's been a shooting." Abigail's heart raced as she hitched up her skirts and hurried inside. The pungent smell of whiskey and sweat assaulted her senses as she pushed through the crowd of onlookers. A man lay on the floor, blood seeping through his shirt. "Everyone back," she commanded, kneeling beside the wounded stranger. He was handsome despite the pain etched across his face, strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of the Colorado sky. "Madam," he managed, "seems I've gotten myself into a spot of trouble." "Save your strength," Abigail instructed, examining the wound in his shoulder. "The bullet went clean through. You're lucky." "Lucky," he attempted a smile. "I've been called many things, but never lucky." "What's your name?" she asked, working quickly to stop the bleeding. "Drew Vance," he replied, wincing as she applied pressure to the wound. "Most folks call me Drew." "Well, Mr. Vance, I'm Dr. Abigail Harmon, and I'm going to need to get you to my office to properly treat this wound." 2 men helped carry Drew to her small medical practice across the street. As they laid him on her examination table, the sheriff, a gruff man named Hollister, appeared in the doorway. "Another gunslinger?" he asked, eyeing Drew with suspicion. "I don't know what he is," Abigail replied tersely, "but he's my patient now." After the sheriff departed, she worked methodically to clean and bandage Drew's wound. He remained surprisingly stoic, watching her with curious eyes. "A female doctor," he observed. "That's not something you see every day in these parts." "I imagine not," she replied, continuing her work. "Most people are surprised when they first meet me." "Not surprised," Drew corrected. "Impressed." Abigail felt a blush creep into her cheeks but kept her focus on the task at hand. "You should rest here tonight. I'll check on you in the morning." As she turned to leave, he caught her wrist gently. "Thank you, Dr. Harmon. I'm in your debt." "Just doing my job, Mr. Vance." That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to the mysterious man in her examination room. There was something about him, a kindness in his eyes that belied his rugged appearance. In her 3 years as a physician, she'd treated all manner of men, but none had affected her quite like Drew Vance. By morning he was sitting up, looking considerably better despite the pallor in his face from blood loss. "How are you feeling?" she asked, checking his bandages. "Like I've been shot," he replied with a wry smile. "But I've had worse." "That's not particularly reassuring, Mr. Vance." "Drew," he corrected. "And what brings a woman like you to a rough place like Gold Hill? You don't seem like the frontier type." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "And what type do I seem like? Educated, refined." His eyes met hers. "Too good for a mining town full of desperate men and broken dreams." "I go where I'm needed," she said simply. "Not many doctors are willing to practice in these remote areas." Drew nodded thoughtfully. "Noble of you, not nobility. Necessity." She finished changing his bandage. "The world is changing, Mr. Vance. Women are finding their place in it, even out here. I can see that." His gaze was warm, admiring, "and I'm grateful for it, considering the circumstances." Over the next few days, as Drew recovered in her care, Abigail learned more about him. He was a cattle driver turned rancher, with a small spread just outside of Denver. He'd come to Gold Hill to sell some horses, and had the misfortune of winning too much in a poker game against the wrong man. "So you're not a gunslinger?" she asked one evening as she brought him supper. Drew laughed. "No, madam. I can handle myself in a fight when needed, but I'm just a simple rancher." "There's nothing simple about ranching in this territory," Abigail remarked. "True enough." He studied her for a moment. "And there's nothing simple about being a female doctor, I'd wager." Abigail smiled sadly. "No, there isn't. You never did tell me your story," he prompted. "How does a woman become a doctor in times like these?" Abigail sat in the chair beside his bed, surprising herself with her willingness to share. "My father was a physician in Boston. He had no sons, so he taught me everything he knew. When the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania opened, he insisted I attend. After I graduated, I worked alongside him until—" She paused, the memory still painful. "Until he died of pneumonia last year." "I'm sorry," Drew said softly. "After that, I decided I wanted to go where I could make a real difference. The West needed doctors more than Boston did." "Their loss is our gain," Drew said with such sincerity that Abigail felt that unfamiliar warmth spreading through her again. By the end of the week, Drew was well enough to leave, though Abigail insisted he take it easy for at least another fortnight. "I have some business to finish in town," he told her as he prepared to depart. "Then I need to head back to my ranch. But I'd be honored if you join me for supper before I go." Abigail hesitated, but only briefly. "I'd like that." That evening they dined at the Gold Hill Hotel, the only establishment in town that could be considered remotely elegant. Drew cleaned up nicely, his brown hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. In his dark suit, he cut a striking figure that turned more than a few heads. "You look beautiful," he said when she arrived in her best dress, a deep blue gown that brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly feeling shy despite her usual confidence. Over dinner, they talked about everything from books to politics, discovering a shared love of Dickens and surprisingly aligned views on the rights of women and minorities' progressive stances that Abigail hadn't expected from a cowboy. "You're not what I expected, Drew Vance," she admitted as they walked back to her office under a canopy of stars. "Is that good or bad?" he asked, his hand brushing against hers. "Good," she said decisively. "Very good." When they reached her door, Drew took her hand. "I'll be leaving tomorrow, but I'd like to call on you again if I may." Abigail's heart fluttered. "I'd like that too." He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, his lips lingering just long enough to send a shiver down her spine. "Thank you for saving my life, Dr. Harmon." "Abigail," she corrected softly. "Abigail," he repeated, the name sounding like a caress on his lips. After Drew departed the next morning, Abigail threw herself into her work, trying not to count the days until he might return. She had patients to attend to, including several minors with lung ailments and a pregnant woman on the verge of delivery. 2 weeks passed with no word from Drew. Abigail told herself it was for the best she had come to the frontier to be a doctor, not to fall in love with a cowboy, no matter how charming or kind. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he appeared at her door, soaked to the skin but smiling broadly. "Drew!" she exclaimed, ushering him inside. "What on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "Calling on you as promised," he replied, removing his hat. Water dripped from his clothes onto her floor. "I would have come sooner, but there was trouble at the ranch that needed tending." "You're shivering," Abigail observed, immediately slipping into doctor mode. "Let me find you something dry to wear." She located a shirt and trousers that had been left by a previous patient and showed Drew to a room where he could change. When he emerged, looking somewhat comical in the ill-fitting clothes, she had hot coffee waiting. "You're too good to me," he said, accepting the cup gratefully. "I'm good to all my patients," she replied with a small smile. Drew's expression grew serious. "I'm hoping to be more than just your patient, Abigail." Her heart skipped a beat. "And what would you like to be?" "A friend to start with." He set down his cup. "I've thought about you every day since I left." Abigail swallowed hard. "I've thought about you too." Over the next few months, Drew made the journey to Gold Hill whenever he could, staying for a day or two before returning to his ranch. Each visit deepened their connection, and Abigail found herself falling for him despite her initial reservations. They shared their first real kiss on a mild spring evening, standing by the creek that ran behind her small house. Drew had been helping her gather herbs for medicines, and as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold, he turned to her with such tenderness in his eyes that Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Harmon," he'd whispered, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. "I think I'm already there," she'd admitted, rising on her tiptoes to meet his lips with her own. The kiss was everything she'd dreamed. It would be gentle yet passionate, a promise of things to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Drew pressed his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Not out here, not anywhere." Abigail smiled, her heart full to bursting. Perhaps some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely. By summer, they had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Drew expanded his business dealings in Gold Hill to justify his frequent visits, even purchasing a small property in town where he could stay. One warm August evening, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Drew took her hand. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically nervous. "A dangerous pastime," Abigail teased, squeezing his fingers. "I've been thinking about us," he clarified. "About our future." Abigail's heart began to race. "Oh, I love you, Abigail, more than I thought possible. And I know you have your practice here, your patients who need you." "But," she prompted when he hesitated, "but I'm wondering if you might consider a life with me. My ranch isn't too far a day's ride. You could still practice medicine, perhaps in the nearby town, or even open a practice on the ranch itself for the workers and neighbors." Abigail stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you asking me to marry you, Drew Vance?" He smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I am, if you'll have me." Inside the box was a delicate gold ring with a small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "It was my mother's," Drew explained. "My father gave it to her when they came west together, looking for a new life." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in October when the aspens had turned to gold and the mountains wore their first dusting of snow. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by Abigail's patients who had become friends, Drew's ranch hands, and a few acquaintances from town. Abigail wore a cream-colored gown with lace at the collar and cuffs, her dark hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Drew couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him in the small church, his expression one of wonder and devotion. "You are the most beautiful sight I've ever seen," he whispered as she reached him. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Drew gathered Abigail in his arms and kissed her with such passion that several of the ladies present blushed and looked away. After the ceremony, they traveled by coach to Drew's ranch outside Denver. Willow Creek Ranch, as it was called, was larger than Abigail had imagined, a sprawling property with a handsome two-story house, several barns and outbuildings, and meadows dotted with cattle and horses stretching as far as the eye could see. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," Drew said as he carried her across the threshold. The interior of the house was surprisingly refined, with polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and even a small library filled with books. "It's beautiful," Abigail gasped, turning in a circle to take it all in. "My mother had a hand in the decorating before she passed," Drew explained. "She believed a home should be both practical and beautiful." He hesitated. "I hope you'll feel the same way, and feel free to make any changes you like. This is your home now." Abigail wrapped her arms around his neck. "It's perfect, and so are you." Their first year of marriage was a time of adjustment and joy. Abigail set up a small medical practice in a converted outbuilding, treating the ranch hands, neighboring farmers and their families. Word spread quickly of the skilled doctor at Willow Creek, and soon she had a steady stream of patients. Drew proved to be a supportive husband, proud of his wife's abilities, and never complaining when she was called away at odd hours to tend to the sick or injured. They worked as a team, each respecting the other's skills and passions. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, reading or talking, sometimes just enjoying the comfortable silence between them. At night, they discovered the depths of their passion for each other, their love growing deeper with each passing day. As spring approached, Abigail began to hope for a child. She had always wanted to be a mother, to pass on the knowledge her father had shared with her, to raise children who would understand the value of compassion and service. But as the months passed with no sign of pregnancy, a familiar worry began to gnaw at her. She had never mentioned it to Drew, but there had been a reason she had remained unmarried until the age of 28, despite numerous suitors in Boston. One night in late summer, as they lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of thunder, Abigail gathered her courage. "Drew," she began, her voice barely audible over the storm, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before we married." Drew propped himself up on one elbow, concerned by the tremor in her voice. "What is it, love?" Abigail took a deep breath. "When I was 21, I became very ill with a fever. The doctors, they weren't sure I would survive." She swallowed hard. "I did, obviously, but there were complications, internal scarring that." Her voice broke. Drew stroked her hair gently. "It's all right. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Tears slid down Abigail's cheeks. "I can't have children, Drew. The doctors were quite certain. That's why I threw myself into my studies, into my career. I knew I couldn't have the family I dreamed of, so I found another way to nurture, to care for others." She couldn't look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes, disappointment, regret, maybe even anger that she had kept this from him. "I should have told you before," she whispered. "I understand if you feel deceived." Drew was silent for a long moment, and Abigail's heart clenched with fear. Then he gently turned her face toward his, wiping away her tears with his thumb. "Abigail," he said softly, "look at me." Reluctantly, she met his gaze, bracing herself for the worst. "I married you," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Not the children you might bear, your brilliant mind, your compassionate heart, your strength and determination. But every man wants sons," she argued weakly. "Heirs to carry on their name, to inherit their land." Drew shook his head. "I want you. You're all I ever wanted, all I'll ever need." "You say that now," Abigail persisted, the fear and doubt of years spilling out. "But in time you'll resent me for not giving you a family." "You really think so little of my love?" Drew asked, hurt flickering in his eyes. "Abigail, family isn't just about blood. It's about love, commitment, the life we build together." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "If God blesses us with children through other means, adoption, perhaps then I'll be grateful. But if it's just you and me until we're old and gray, that will be enough. More than enough." Abigail buried her face against his chest, overwhelmed by his acceptance. "I love you so much," she whispered. "And I love you," he replied. "Nothing will ever change that." As the months passed, Abigail's fear that Drew would regret his choice faded. He never mentioned children unless she did, never showed any sign of disappointment in their childless state. Instead, they built a life rich in other ways, expanding the ranch, growing her medical practice, becoming integral parts of their community. They had been married nearly 2 years when tragedy struck a neighboring farm. The Patterson family father, mother, and 3 young children all perished when their home caught fire in the night. Only the youngest child, a baby boy not yet a year old, survived, pulled from the flames by a quick-thinking farm hand. Abigail was called to treat the infant's burns. Though not life-threatening, they were painful, and the tiny boy's cries tore at her heart as she gently applied salves to his reddened skin. "What will happen to him?" she asked the sheriff who had brought the child to her. The lawman shrugged. "No family that we know of." Pattersons were new to these parts. "I reckon the county will have to find a place for him." Drew, who had been watching Abigail tend to the baby, stepped forward. "What sort of place?" "Orphanage, most likely. Nearest one's in Denver." Abigail and Drew exchanged a look, an entire conversation passing between them without words. "He can stay with us," Drew said decisively. "At least until other arrangements are made." And so little James, named after the father he would never know, came to Willow Creek Ranch. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement gradually, inevitably, became permanent. The baby thrived under Abigail and Drew's care, his burns healing without significant scarring, his solemn little face breaking into smiles more frequently as the weeks passed. By the time the paperwork for legal adoption was completed 6 months later, James was toddling around the house, calling Abigail Mama and Drew Dada, completely unaware that he had not been born to them. "He's ours now," Abigail whispered as they watched him sleep in the nursery they had prepared. "Truly ours." Drew wrapped his arm around her waist. "He always was, from the moment you first held him." Their family grew again 2 years later when twin girls were left at Abigail's clinic, Emily and Elizabeth, 3 years old, with matching copper curls and solemn green eyes. Their mother, a widow, had died of consumption, and there was no father in the picture. 2 more. Drew asked when Abigail brought them home, his eyes twinkling. "At this rate, we'll need to build an addition." And they did just that, expanding the house to accommodate their growing family. James took to his role as big brother with enthusiasm, protective and proud of his sisters, as he called them. Life at Willow Creek was busy, sometimes chaotic, but filled with love. The children grew and thrived, each developing their own distinct personality. James, thoughtful and methodical like Drew. Emily, fiercely independent with a talent for numbers. Elizabeth, gentle and nurturing, already showing signs of following in her mother's medical footsteps. When Abigail turned 35, a young woman named Sarah arrived at the ranch, heavily pregnant and desperate. Her husband had abandoned her, and her family had cast her out. She had heard of the doctor at Willow Creek who helped those in need without judgment. Abigail took her in without hesitation, helping her through the difficult birth of a son, comforting her when childbed fever set in shortly after. As Sarah's condition worsened, she gripped Abigail's hand. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice faint. "Promise you'll care for him." "I promise," Abigail assured her, tears streaming down her face. She had tried everything to save the young woman, but without the modern hospitals of the East, there was little more she could do. "He'll be loved as if he were my own." Sarah died just before dawn, her baby boy asleep in the cradle beside her bed. Abigail named him Samuel, after her father, and brought him into their already full home and hearts. 4 children, Drew marveled as they sat on the porch one evening, watching James, now 7, teach the 5-year-old twins to catch fireflies while baby Samuel slept in Abigail's arms. More than I ever dreamed of. Too many? Abigail asked, a hint of her old insecurity surfacing. Drew shook his head, his eyes full of love as he looked at his family. Just right, perfect in fact. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. The children attended the local school. Then James went off to college in Denver, returning with a degree in agriculture and new ideas for expanding the ranch. The twins followed a few years later, Emily to study business, Elizabeth to pursue medicine like her mother. Samuel, the baby of the family, showed an aptitude for both ranching and healing, often accompanying Drew on his rounds of the property and Abigail on her medical calls. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Drew surprised Abigail with a trip to Boston, her first return to her hometown since they had married. They visited her father's grave, now well-tended thanks to the arrangements Drew had quietly made years ago. They toured the women's medical college, where Elizabeth would soon be attending, following in her mother's footsteps. Any regrets? Drew asked as they stood on the deck of the steamship that would take them back to Colorado, watching the Boston shoreline recede in the distance. Abigail leaned against his shoulder, gray now threaded through his brown hair, lines of laughter etched around his eyes. Not one, she replied honestly. Though I do miss the children, Drew laughed. Our children are grown now, love, or nearly so. They'll always be our children, Abigail insisted, no matter how old they get. When they returned to Willow Creek, they found a surprise waiting. All 4 children had gathered for an anniversary celebration, bringing with them James's new wife, a lovely schoolteacher named Olivia, and Elizabeth's fiancé, a young doctor she had met during her preliminary medical studies. Her heart swelled with gratitude. This was her family, created not through her body but through love, through choice, through the generosity of the man who had once told her she was all he'd ever wanted and had spent the last 20 years proving it. Later, as she and Drew prepared for bed, Abigail found herself overcome with emotion. "What is it, love?" Drew asked, concerned. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "about that night I told you I couldn't have children. How afraid I was that you would regret marrying me." Drew took her hands in his. "I remember. I was so wrong," she whispered. "Look at our family, Drew. Look at what we've built together." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace as strong and sure as it had been on their wedding day. "We've been blessed beyond measure," he agreed. "But the greatest blessing of all was finding you, Abigail. Everything else, the ranch, the children, all of it flows from that one perfect gift." Abigail rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When I came west, I thought I was leaving behind any chance for a family. I thought my work would be my only legacy." "And instead," Drew prompted gently. She smiled, thinking of their children, of the grandchildren that would surely come in time, of the countless patients she had treated over the years, of the young doctors she had mentored. "Instead, I found everything I ever wanted, a purpose, a home." She looked up at the man who had changed her life with his love and acceptance. "And you," Drew kissed her then, a kiss as full of promise and passion as their first had been all those years ago by the creek in Gold Hill. "And I found you," he whispered against her lips. "My partner, my love, my heart." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Abigail thought about the long, winding path that had brought her to this place of perfect contentment. From Boston to Colorado, from lonely doctor to beloved wife and mother, from fear to faith. It hadn't always been easy, but every step, Every challenge had led her home. The morning sun streamed through their bedroom window, beginning another day at Willow Creek Ranch. Outside, she could hear Samuel whistling as he headed to the barn, the clatter of dishes as Emily prepared breakfast, Elizabeth's laughter mingling with her fiancé's deeper voice. Drew stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," he murmured, as he had nearly every morning for 20 years. "Good morning, my love," she replied, turning to face him, drinking in the sight of his dear, familiar face. "Shall we join our family?" he nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before rising. "Our family," he repeated, the words still filling him with wonder after all these years. "I like the sound of that." Hand in hand, they went downstairs to greet the new day. Surrounded by the love they had created together, a love that had proven stronger than any obstacle, richer than any dream, more enduring than any doubt. In the years that followed, Willow Creek Ranch continued to flourish. James and Olivia took over much of the daily management, modernizing operations while honoring the traditions Drew had established. They welcomed 3 children of their own, 2 boys, and a girl who filled the house with laughter once more. Emily, with her head for business, established a successful banking venture in Denver but returned home frequently, especially after she married a kind-hearted lawyer who shared her passion for justice and progress. Elizabeth completed her medical studies and joined her mother's practice, eventually taking over as Abigail grew older. Her husband, David, established a small hospital in the nearby town, bringing modern medical care to an area that had long depended primarily on Abigail's skills and determination. Samuel, the youngest, surprised everyone by combining his interests in ranching and medicine to become a veterinarian, his gentle hands healing the animals that were the lifeblood of Willow Creek and the surrounding farms. As their grandchildren grew, Abigail and Drew found new joy in sharing their wisdom and love with another generation. They told stories of the early days, of Gold Hill and the gunshot that had brought them together, of building a life and a family against all odds. On warm summer evenings, they still sat together on the porch, Drew's arm around Abigail's shoulders, watching the fireflies dance just as they had when their children were small. Their hair was white now, their steps slower, but the love between them burned as brightly as ever. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" Abigail asked on the evening of their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren. "The best," Drew agreed, his blue eyes, though faded with age, still looking at her with the same adoration they had shown that first day in her clinic in Gold Hill. "Because we've had each other." As the sun set on Willow Creek Ranch, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a young woman afraid her inability to bear children would deny her the joy of family, to the matriarch of this sprawling clan, blessed beyond measure, Drew had been right all those years ago. Family wasn't about blood. It was about love, commitment, the life they had built together. And in that, they had been richly, abundantly blessed. She reached for his hand, weathered and work-worn like her own, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of half a century together. "I love you, Drew Vance," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of their shared history. "And I love you, Abigail Vance," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "You're still all I ever wanted." In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the legacy of love they had created, they shared a smile that spoke of promises kept, fears overcome, and a life well lived together.